There was a beat-up leather ledger my husband kept in the bottom of his truck's toolbox, the kind of thing you'd mistake for garbage if you didn't know what it cost him to fill every page of it. 6 years after his sister threw it in a donation bag and called it junk, that same ledger, and 3 sentences written on its last page in his own handwriting, would end with federal agents walking into a bank lobby and arresting the 2 people who spent 6 years telling my entire family I was a thief. This is the story of how I got blamed for stealing $85,000 I never touched, how I sat across a kitchen table for 6 years, listening to my own reputation get rewritten by people who knew exactly where that money had gone, and how the man I buried made absolutely sure I'd have the last word anyway, even though he wasn't around to say it himself. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that grief is never a business opportunity, and that the people who really love you in death were usually protecting you long before you ever knew you needed it. My name is Maren Whitaker, and for most of my life, I was the kind of woman nobody looked at twice, which is exactly how I liked it. I grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, in the back rooms of my father's locksmith shop on Route 9, a narrow storefront called Doyle Lock and Key that smelled like machine oil and cut brass shavings, and the particular dust that settles on a place that's been open 30 years without ever being remodeled. The bell over the door had a crack in it that made it ring flat instead of bright, and I could still pick that sound out of a crowd if I heard it today. My dad, Walt Doyle, ran that place for 31 years, standing behind the same scratched glass counter, wearing the same style of gray work shirt with his name stitched over the pocket, year after year, replacing the shirts only when the fabric finally gave out at the elbows, never the style. By the time I was 12, he had me sweeping the floor and sorting blanks by bidding number into the little wooden drawers that lined the back wall like a card catalog. And by 14, he was letting me pick a 5-pin quickset with a tension wrench and a rake just to see if I still remembered how the pins fell, standing over my shoulder with his arms crossed, not saying anything unless I got frustrated, and then only saying, "Slow down, you're listening with your hands, not your eyes." He taught me the difference between a lock that had been picked and a lock that had simply failed with age, the subtle scarring on the pins that told a story if you knew how to read it. And he taught me that almost nothing in the world that looks broken beyond repair actually is, if you're patient enough to figure out what's actually wrong with it, instead of just what it looks like from the outside. He used to say a lock isn't a mystery, it's a conversation. You just have to listen for the click. He said it so many times over the years that I stopped hearing it as advice and started hearing it as just something true about the world, the way you stop hearing the hum of a refrigerator. I didn't know it then, sweeping metal shavings into a dustpan on a Tuesday afternoon while my father rekeyed a deadbolt for a woman who'd just left her husband, quiet tears running down her face while my dad worked without ever once looking up to make her feel watched. But that lesson about patience, about listening instead of forcing, would matter more than almost anything else I ever learned in my life. My father passed when I was 26, 3 years before I met David, of a heart condition nobody caught in time, because he never once in 31 years took a sick day to go see a doctor about anything. And I still have his tension wrenches in a cigar box in my closet, the metal worn smooth from his hands, the leather strap that once held them together cracked with age, but still knotted the exact way he tied it. I left that shop at 18 for community college in Dayton, studying business administration with no particular plan beyond wanting steady work that didn't depend on anyone's mood or the weather, the 2 things that had governed my father's income for 3 decades, some months flush with rekeying jobs after a divorce spike or a rash of break-ins, other months so thin he'd quietly skip his own dinner so my mother wouldn't have to stretch the grocery money further than it could go. By 22, I had a job as a loan processor at First Ohio Savings, a regional bank with 4 branches and a back office full of filing cabinets and green screen terminals that were already outdated the year I started. Machines that made a particular clicking hum when you scrolled through account records that I can still hear sometimes in my memory when I'm doing my own books late at night. I spent 14 years there, working my way from processor to underwriting assistant to, eventually, operations supervisor, which meant I spent my days reconciling general ledgers, verifying wire transfer authorizations against signature cards, cross-checking notarized documents line by line, and learning to spot the small inconsistencies that told you when something on a loan application didn't add up. A decimal point shifted one place to the right, an income figure that didn't match the tax return stapled behind it, a notary stamp with an expiration date that had quietly lapsed 6 weeks earlier. I sat through hours of compliance training on the Bank Secrecy Act and suspicious activity reporting, training most of my coworkers treated as a box to check before lunch, but that I actually read line by line, because something about the architecture of fraud, the specific mechanics of how people hide money from people who trust them, fascinated me in a way I never fully admitted out loud. I learned to read a bank statement the way some people read a novel, following the plot of somebody's spending from page to page, noticing when a story stopped making sense, a sudden cash advance the week before a big purchase, a pattern of deposits just under the $10,000 reporting threshold that always made my supervisor raise an eyebrow and pull the file for a second look. I learned what a legitimate trust document looked like, with its named independent trustee and its annual accounting requirements and its clearly defined distribution triggers, and what a sloppy one looked like, vague on purpose, designed to give one person unchecked control while sounding generous on paper. The kind of document a con man's lawyer drafts in an afternoon because its whole purpose is flexibility for one party rather than protection for everyone else. I loved that job more than I ever told anyone because it made me good at something specific and quiet, the kind of skill nobody claps for at a dinner party, the kind that only matters later, when it matters more than almost anything else. I met David Whitaker at a hardware store on a Saturday morning in October, which felt about right for both of us. Two people who would spend the rest of our marriage measuring, fixing, and budgeting things instead of talking about our feelings out loud. He was 29, already running his own small electrical contracting business out of a used panel van with his name hand painted on the side because he couldn't yet afford a proper decal, and he came in for $3 worth of wire nuts and ended up asking me to dinner because I was standing behind him in line, and corrected his math on a rebate coupon he was trying to use wrong, pointing out that the store's own fine print excluded the item he'd already picked up, and that he'd need to swap it for one 2 aisles over if he wanted the discount to actually apply. He laughed when I did it, not embarrassed, just delighted, and said, "You're the first person who's ever made me feel dumb about math and good about it at the same time." I said yes to dinner before he even finished the sentence. David was the quiet architect of everything good that ever happened to our family, and I mean that literally as much as figuratively, because he built half of our house himself, stud by stud, wire by wire, on weekends and evenings after 12-hour jobs, teaching himself framing from library books and asking older contractors questions at the lumber yard, until he understood load-bearing walls well enough to move one in our own living room without anyone getting hurt. He poured the concrete for our back patio himself over a single brutal August weekend, mixing bag after bag by hand because we couldn't yet justify renting a mixer, and he ran the wiring for the garage workshop that would, years later, become the place he taught Josh how to use a multimeter. He never wanted credit for anything he did. He'd finish a wiring job for a stranger and drive home smelling like cut copper and drywall dust. And if I asked how his day went, he'd say fine, and I'd have to pry the details out of him over dinner, small pieces at a time, the way you coax a shy kid into talking about school, until eventually the whole story would come out, usually something quietly impressive he'd never have volunteered on his own. He kept his business books in a leather-filled ledger he carried in his truck, logging every invoice, every material cost, every hour in small neat block letters, because he didn't trust computers not to lose things, and he definitely didn't trust other people to keep track of his money for him. That distrust, I would come to understand many years later, wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition, earned the hard way from watching his own family for decades. We had 2 kids, Josh and Ellie, born 4 years apart, and for 18 years, David and I built a life that looked unremarkable from the outside and felt, to me, like the safest place on earth. We drove 12-year-old cars until they had well over 200,000 miles on them, and David fixed most of what went wrong himself in our garage on Saturday mornings, humming along to the classic rock station, while Josh handed him tools before he was even old enough to know what half of them were called, learning the names of sockets and torque specs the way other kids learned baseball statistics. We paid extra on the mortgage every single month, sometimes only $40 or $50, sometimes more when a big job came in, because David said watching that principal balance shrink faster than the bank expected was its own kind of quiet joy, a private satisfaction he'd mark by circling the new balance on the monthly statement with a red pen and taping it inside the pantry door where only the two of us would ever see it. We didn't take vacations that required a flight. We drove to a lake in Michigan every August and rented the same small cabin for a week, the same peeling green dock, the same overpriced bait shop half a mile down the road. And it remains, to this day, the happiest week of every year of my life, the one stretch of time each summer when David let his shoulders actually drop and stopped, even for a few days, calculating anything at all. David used to say that debt was just fear wearing a suit, and he wanted no part of it. I left my bank job when Ellie was born, not because David asked me to, but because we ran the numbers together at our kitchen table, the way we ran every decision, spreading out his invoices and my old bank knowledge like two people solving a puzzle, and it made sense for me to handle the house and his bookkeeping while he built the business out into something that could eventually support 4 people instead of 1. I kept every invoice organized in a filing system I built myself, color-coded folders labeled by job number and client name, filed his quarterly taxes with a precision that made our accountant, an older man named Stan who barely trusted anyone, once tell me I should have gone into forensic accounting. I reconciled his business account down to the penny every single month, catching the occasional bounced check from a slow-paying customer before it became a real problem, catching double charges from suppliers on materials he'd already paid for at pickup, catching the small errors that, left unaddressed, bleed a small business dry over years. $1 here, $5 there, invisible individually and catastrophic in aggregate if nobody's watching. Nobody outside that kitchen table ever saw how much work went into the life we had. Nobody saw the spreadsheets I kept color-coded by job, the folder system that let David find any receipt from the last 7 years in under a minute, the hours I spent teaching myself basic contractor licensing requirements so I could make sure his insurance and bonding never lapsed, renewing his liability policy 2 full months early every year, because I'd read the fine print closely enough to know a single day's lapse could void coverage on an active claim. That invisibility never bothered me, because I thought I had forever to be quietly proud of it, the way you assume you have forever with anyone you love until the day you find out you don't. David's family was a different animal entirely, and I want to spend some time on this because it matters for everything that came later. His parents had passed years before I met him, his father from lung cancer, his mother from a stroke less than a year after. So the only family left on his side was his older sister, Denise, 4 years his senior, and her husband, Roger Prout, who Denise married when David was still in high school and who David told me on our 3rd date he had never once fully trusted, though he couldn't articulate exactly why beyond a shrug, and he's always selling something, even when there's nothing to sell. Denise ran a boutique in the next town over, a place called Willow and Vine that sold overpriced candles and linen dresses and never seemed to turn a profit but always looked flawless on her social media, all soft golden hour lighting and captions about faith and family and blessings, #grateful, #small business dreams. I used to scroll past those photos sometimes in the years we were still speaking and wonder, quietly, how a shop that never seemed to have customers in it, whenever I actually drove past, managed to fund the renovations Denise posted about twice a year, the new shelving, the reclaimed wood counter, the little gold script sign out front that could not have been cheap. Roger called himself a wealth manager, though as far as I could ever tell over 18 years, his actual job was raising money from people who trusted him, mostly through Denise's church connections and a golf club membership he could not really afford, and putting it into real estate deals that always seemed to be one signature away from paying off big. They drove leased luxury SUVs they replaced every 2 years, an Escalade, then a Range Rover, then back to an Escalade, took 2 vacations a year that Denise documented in exhaustive detail, a beach in Turks and Caicos one January, a ski trip to Colorado the following winter, and never once in 18 years offered to help David and me with so much as a Saturday cookout, a broken water heater, or a loan when our furnace died the winter Ellie was 3, and we had to put it on a credit card David hated using, a debt it took us 5 months of careful budgeting to pay back off, cutting nearly every extra expense we had until the balance hit 0 again. I remember specific holidays with a clarity that surprises me, because at the time I didn't know I'd need to remember them so precisely later. I remember a Thanksgiving when Josh was 7, watching Roger arrive 40 minutes late to David's house with an expensive bottle of wine he made sure everyone saw him carry in, holding it up like a trophy as he walked through the door, and then spend the entire dinner talking about a real estate deal in Sarasota that was, in his words, about to change everything for our family's financial future. If only David would consider putting in $15,000, sketching returns on a paper napkin with a pen he'd brought specifically for that purpose. David said no, gently, the way he said no to everything, and Roger's face did something small and tight before he laughed it off and changed the subject to golf. Though I caught him watching David for the rest of the meal with an expression I couldn't quite name at the time and would only fully understand years later. I remember a Christmas Eve 2 years later when Denise showed up with gifts for our kids that were, without exception, the cheapest items on their wish lists. A $5 coloring book for Ellie when she'd asked for an art set, a single Hot Wheels car for Josh when he'd asked for a whole track, while she and Roger unwrapped, in front of everyone, a set of gifts to each other that included a watch I later found out cost more than David made in 2 full months of electrical work, Denise gasping theatrically as Roger fastened it around her wrist for the whole room to admire. David loved his sister out of habit and old loyalty, the kind of loyalty you carry for someone because you grew up in the same house and buried the same parents. But he never trusted Roger, not for one single day of the 18 years I knew him, and it turned out he had good reason. David died on a Tuesday in March, 6 years ago, from a heart attack on a job site, 47 years old, gone before the ambulance even finished the drive to the hospital. He had complained of indigestion the night before, something so ordinary that neither of us thought twice about it, brushing it off as too much coffee and not enough sleep. And he went to work the next morning the way he went to work every morning, kissing the top of my head while I made coffee, telling Josh to grab his backpack, telling Ellie her hair looked nice. I will not spend long on that day, because some things don't need decoration to be understood, but I will tell you that grief does something to your brain chemistry that makes you slower, foggier, and easier to steer than you have ever been in your life. I did not sleep for 3 days. I could not remember whether I had eaten. I stood in the shower for what felt like 10 minutes and came out to find nearly an hour had passed, the water gone cold around me without my noticing. And into that fog, within 24 hours of David's death, walked Denise and Roger, dressed for a funeral that hadn't happened yet, already talking about what needed to be handled. I want to be precise about what I mean by vultures circling, because it is easy to say and harder to actually witness when it's happening to you in real time, wrapped in the language of love. Denise arrived at my house the morning after David died with a casserole in one hand and a legal pad in the other, her makeup done, her hair styled, looking like a woman who had slept a full 8 hours while I had barely slept 3 in 3 days. She sat me down at my own kitchen table, the same table where David and I had planned every dollar of our life together for 18 years, and she started making lists out loud in a voice that sounded rehearsed even through my fog. Funeral home, obituary, life insurance paperwork. She said the word paperwork like it was a kindness she was doing me, like she was lifting something heavy off my back before I could even feel the weight of it settle. Roger stood behind her the entire time with his phone already out, texting someone while he talked, saying things like, "Don't you worry about any of the financial side, Marin. That's what family is for. We'll take care of it so you can focus on the kids. David would want us looking out for you." That same afternoon, while I was upstairs trying to find something for Josh to wear to the viewing, standing in his closet holding 2 different button-down shirts, and unable to decide between them for almost 10 minutes, unable to make even that small decision, my hands actually shaking as I held the hangers, Denise went out to David's truck to, in her words, clean it out before somebody towed it from the job site where it had been parked when the ambulance came. That's where she found his field ledger, the leather one he'd carried for over a decade, wedged behind the driver's seat with a rubber band around it and a pen clipped to the cover, exactly where he always kept it. I came downstairs in time to see her holding it over a black garbage bag she'd already half filled with old work gloves and fast food napkins from the truck's console, receipts from gas stations, a spare pair of David's steel-toed boots that had been rolling around in the passenger footwell for months, a phone charger cord tangled with a coil of leftover electrical tape. I asked her what that was. She looked at it like it had personally offended her, flipped through a few pages of David's cramped handwriting, invoice numbers and material costs and small margin notes about difficult customers, and said, "It's just his work junk, Marin, receipts and scribbles, nothing you need to be carrying around right now while you're grieving. It's clutter, honestly, and clutter is the last thing you need in this house right now. I'll take the whole bag to the dump on my way home. You don't even have to think about it." She dropped it into the trash bag before I could fully process what she'd said, tied the bag off with a practiced flourish, and set it by the back door like the matter was closed, already moving on to the next item on her legal pad, asking me without pausing for breath whether I'd decided on a burial suit yet or wanted her to pick one up from the cleaners herself. I don't fully know why I went back for it. Maybe it was 14 years of bank training telling me that nobody throws away a man's financial records the day after he dies without a reason, that even in grief, financial documents belong to the estate and shouldn't leave a house without someone reviewing them first. Maybe it was just love, wanting one more thing in his handwriting that Denise hadn't decided was disposable, one more object that held the shape of his actual hours, the actual jobs, the actual life he'd built with his own hands. Either way, that night, after everyone had finally left and the house was quiet enough to hear the refrigerator hum and the furnace click on and off, I went out to the trash bag by the back door, sat down on the cold linoleum in my socks, untied it, and pulled the ledger out from under a pile of coffee grounds and paper towels and one of David's old work gloves, which I held against my face for a moment before I could make myself set it down, breathing in the faint smell of him that still clung to the leather. I wiped the ledger off with a dish towel and sat with it at the kitchen table until almost 2 a.m, reading through years of David's handwriting, invoices for panel upgrades and service calls dated back nearly 9 years, notes about which customers paid late and which ones tipped him in beer instead of cash, small tallies of profit margins on jobs he'd bid too low because he felt bad charging an elderly widow full price. I found a page from the winter Josh was born where he'd written, in the margin beside an invoice for a rewiring job, "New baby tonight, tired but good tired," and I sat with that single line for a long time before I could keep reading. I found myself smiling despite everything, recognizing him so completely in every cramped, careful line, in the way he underlined totals twice, in the small doodles of circuit diagrams in the margins when he was clearly thinking through a problem while waiting on hold with a supplier. On the very last page, in ink that looked newer than the rest, in David's small block letters that I would have recognized anywhere in the world, there were 3 lines that stopped my heart colder than anything at the funeral home had managed to. It said, "If anything happens to me, do not let Denise or Roger anywhere near the insurance money or anything with my name on it. Call Harold Voss first before you sign one single thing. Protect the kids. Protect yourself. I love you, D." I sat there for a long time with that ledger open on the table under the kitchen light, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because it wasn't just fear. It was recognition, cold and immediate, the way you recognize a smell before you can name it. Some part of me, some part I hadn't let myself listen to in 18 years of watching Roger dodge every family gathering that required opening his wallet, some part that had noticed every skipped Saturday, every excuse, every leased SUV replaced, while David drove a truck with 240,000 miles on it, already knew that page was coming before I ever read it. I just hadn't had proof. Now I did, written in the hand of the man who never lied to me about anything in his life, a man who chose his words as carefully as he chose his tools. And I understood, sitting alone in my kitchen at 2 a.m. 3 days after burying my husband, that I was about to need every skill my father and my old bank job had ever taught me. I did not tell Denise or Roger that I had found the ledger. I dried it carefully, wrapped it in a T-shirt of David's I hadn't yet washed, and put it in the bottom of my sock drawer, under a false cardboard liner I'd once used to hide Christmas presents from small, curious hands. I decided, right then, sitting on the floor of my bedroom at nearly 3 in the morning, that I would let them believe I was exactly as foggy and helpless as I looked. That decision would end up saving my family everything, though it would take 6 long years for me to understand just how much. The days that followed David's funeral moved fast, faster than grief should be allowed to move, because Denise and Roger did not believe in giving anyone time to simply sit with a loss. The funeral itself was a blur I remember only in fragments. David's co-workers standing awkwardly in their good clothes, Josh gripping my hand so hard it left marks, Ellie asking me quietly if Daddy could hear us, Denise crying dramatically at the front of the church in a way that felt, even then, slightly performed, angled toward the largest cluster of relatives rather than toward David's casket, dabbing carefully at her eyes with a tissue in a way that never once smudged her mascara. Within a week of the burial, Roger sat across from me at my kitchen table with a folder of paperwork and a tone of voice he must have practiced in the mirror, warm and low. The voice of a man who wants you to believe he's carrying your burden for you so completely that you'd feel ungrateful questioning him. He told me the life insurance check, $85,000 from David's term policy, a policy David had increased just 2 years earlier when his business started growing, would be arriving any day. And that instead of just dropping that kind of money into a regular savings account where it would, in his words, get eaten alive by inflation and taxes, he wanted to set it up in a family trust structure that he could manage on my behalf, something that would protect it for Josh and Ellie's college funds and grow it faster than any bank could, something he called, with a straight face, a legacy vehicle. I remember exactly what I did in that moment because it was the first calculated decision of my entire ordeal. I let my eyes go a little unfocused. I let my voice come out thinner than it needed to, a half octave higher, trailing at the ends of sentences the way exhausted, grieving people actually talk. I said something like, "I don't know, Roger. I can barely think straight right now. Whatever you think is best. David always said you knew about money," which was a lie David had never once said, but which I offered up because I knew it would please him more than almost anything else I could have said in that moment. I want you to understand that inside, every alarm bell 14 years of bank training had ever installed in me was screaming at a volume I had to physically work to keep off my face. Because no legitimate financial advisor asks a grieving widow to hand over a life insurance check before it has even arrived. And no honest trust structure needs to be set up in the 7 days between a funeral and a check clearing. Real trusts take weeks to draft properly, with an attorney present, with disclosure documents, with time for the client to review terms without a deadline manufactured out of thin air. But I also understood, with the same clarity, that if I refused him outright, if I showed him one flicker of suspicion this early, he and Denise would simply find another angle, tighten their approach, and I would lose the chance to see how far they were willing to go before I had any proof at all. So I played weak. I played tired. I let Denise refill my coffee and pat my hand and tell me over and over how lucky I was to have family who would take care of everything so I didn't have to lift a finger during the hardest season of my life. She said things like, "David would be so relieved knowing Rogers got this handled," and I nodded and let her believe I found comfort in it, while privately cataloging every phrase for later, the way you'd catalog evidence, because some part of me already understood I might need to remember exactly what they'd said and when. And I started quietly, keeping a small paper calendar in the kitchen drawer where I noted, in shorthand only I would understand, the date and gist of every conversation, every dollar amount mentioned, every promise made. When the check arrived 12 days later, I did something Roger did not expect, though he never knew it at the time and I never told him. Instead of endorsing it over to whatever account he wanted set up, I deposited it into my own checking account first, the one only my name was on, the one David and I had held jointly for 18 years, and that had converted automatically to my sole ownership at his death under the bank's standard survivorship rules, something I knew from 14 years of processing exactly those kinds of accounts. Roger had assumed, because grief makes people assume things about how compliant you'll be, that I would simply hand him a check to redirect wherever he wanted. I did not. I told him the bank required me to deposit it first before any transfer could process, which was true, and which bought me time I didn't yet know I would desperately need. That single delay is the reason this story does not end with me losing everything, though I did not understand that at the time. What I understood in the moment was that Roger's face changed for about half a second when I told him the money was already sitting in my account, a flicker of something less patient than his usual smoothness, a tightening around his eyes, gone as fast as it came. He recovered instantly and said, "That's fine, that's totally fine. We'll just need you to sign a transfer authorization once it clears. No rush at all, take whatever time you need." There was a rush. I could feel it in every phone call over the following 2 weeks. In the way Denise started dropping by unannounced with paperwork already filled out except for my signature line, always arriving during the kids' nap time or right after school pickup, when I was at my most scattered, standing in my doorway with a folder tucked under her arm and a look on her face that said she'd timed her arrival on purpose. I could feel it in the way Roger began talking about a specific investment window closing, a real estate opportunity in a new development outside Columbus that wouldn't wait. A phrase, "wouldn't wait," that he used so often over those 2 weeks it started to feel like a verbal tick. Something he must have picked up from whatever seminar or sales training had taught him to close deals with urgency instead of substance. I read every document he put in front of me from top to bottom, slowly, deliberately, the way 14 years of loan processing had trained me to, sitting with my reading glasses on at the kitchen table, while Roger tried to hover and explain things I understood better than he did, tapping his finger on a paragraph and saying, "This part just means," before I'd already finished reading 3 paragraphs ahead of him. I found that most of them were vague on purpose, general trust language, without specific beneficiary protections. No named independent trustee, no annual accounting requirement, no clause preventing self-dealing, nothing that would have stopped Roger from moving that money anywhere he wanted the moment it landed in whatever account he was proposing. I noted, in my private shorthand calendar, exactly which clauses were missing and on which dates I'd raised questions Roger had brushed past without ever actually answering. I stalled for as long as I reasonably could without breaking character. I told them I needed time to grieve before making big decisions, which was true and also strategic. I told them I wanted to talk to David's old business accountant, Stan, first, a small lie that bought me another week, since Stan had actually retired to Florida 2 years earlier and I had no intention of calling him. But grief fog is not something you can perform forever without eventually breaking character under sustained pressure, and 6 weeks after David's funeral, worn down by daily phone calls and family pressure and Denise's increasingly pointed comments, made in front of my own children at a Sunday dinner she'd insisted on hosting, about how David would have wanted his sister taken care of too. Family looks out for family, Marin. That's what he would have wanted, said with Josh and Ellie sitting right there listening to every word. I made the one mistake David's ledger had specifically warned me against. I signed a limited authorization letting Roger, quote, temporarily manage and invest $60,000 of the insurance proceeds in a diversified real estate fund for the benefit of the children's education, with the remaining $25,000 staying in my account for immediate expenses. I remember signing it at my kitchen table, Roger's pen in my hand, Denise standing behind me with her hand on my shoulder saying, "This is going to be such a relief. You'll see," and I remember the specific sound the pen made against the paper, a small scratch I can still hear if I let myself think about it too long. And I remember Roger's shoulders visibly relaxing the instant the last letter of my signature was down, a detail I didn't consciously register as important until years later, replaying that afternoon over and over in my mind. I want to be honest about why I signed it, because I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since, on sleepless nights, in the shower, driving alone in the car. Part of it was exhaustion, a bone-deep tiredness that 6 weeks of single parenting through grief had built into something almost physical, the kind of tired where your own hands feel like they belong to someone else. Part of it was that Denise had started saying, in front of my own children, that their father would be so disappointed if I let bitterness keep them from having a relationship with their aunt and uncle. And I could not bear the idea of Josh and Ellie losing more family than they already had, on top of losing their dad. And part of it, the part that still makes me angriest at myself even now, was that some small piece of me still wanted to believe that David's sister, whatever her faults, whatever 18 years of small selfishness I'd witnessed, would not actually steal from her own dead brother's children. I wanted that to be true so badly that I let it override everything I actually knew. The $60,000 went into an account under something called Prute Capital Group, LLC, and within 4 months it was gone. Not gone in the sense of a bad investment that lost value, which happens and is at least honest. The kind of loss a legitimate advisor would explain with actual documentation, actual quarterly statements, actual transaction histories, actual phone calls returned promptly and answered directly. Gone in the sense that when I finally, months later, worked up the nerve to ask to see a statement showing where the money had gone and what it had earned, Roger produced a single-page printout, not even on letterhead, showing a fund allocation that no licensed broker I would later consult had ever heard of, tied to a shell company registered in Delaware called Heritage Capital Holdings, with no public filings, no prospectus, no SEC registration I could find, and no way to verify that the money existed anywhere except in Roger's word, and a printout that looked like it had been made in somebody's home office on an ordinary inkjet printer. The kind of document that wouldn't survive 30 seconds of scrutiny from anyone who'd ever actually worked in finance. When I pushed harder, asking specific questions I remembered from my banking years, asking for account numbers, asking who the fund's custodian was, asking for the fund's EIN so I could at least verify it existed as a registered entity, Denise's tone changed completely, the warmth evaporating in a single conversation, replaced by something clipped and defensive, as though I had personally insulted her by asking basic financial questions about $60,000 of my dead husband's life insurance money. She stopped refilling my coffee. She told the rest of David's extended family, aunts and cousins and family friends I had known for 18 years, people who had come to our wedding and held our children as babies, that I had, in her words, blown through David's life insurance on myself within a year of his death. Shopping trips, a new car, spa days, anything she could invent to sound plausible and damning at the same time. She never said this to my face where I could correct it with facts. She said it in group texts I wasn't part of, at family gatherings I was no longer invited to, in phone calls to David's 91-year-old aunt in Florida, who I had once driven 4 hours to visit twice a year, and who, by the following Christmas, would not return my calls, and who died 3 years later without ever speaking to me again, believing, until the end, that I had stolen from my own dead husband. I wrote her a letter once, that first year, trying to explain, and never got a response, and I still don't know if she ever read it or if Denise intercepted it somehow before it reached her, a small mystery I'll never resolve now. Within a year, my kids and I were cut out of every holiday on David's side of the family. No Thanksgiving invitation. No Christmas Eve gathering that Josh and Ellie had attended every year of their lives with their cousins. The 2 children Denise and Roger had, both older, both largely indifferent to Josh and Ellie once the invitations stopped. No birthday cards from aunts who used to send $20 folded into a card every year without fail. Denise controlled the narrative completely, because I had no proof of anything beyond a ledger I was too afraid to reveal, and because I had made the strategic choice, the same one I'd make again, not to fight publicly for a reputation I couldn't yet defend with facts, understanding that a woman crying foul with no documentation just sounds like a woman making excuses, and that any attempt to expose them prematurely, without proof, would only confirm in everyone's mind exactly the picture Denise had already painted, a bitter, unstable widow lashing out at the family trying to help her. I told my children the truth in small, age-appropriate pieces over those first couple of years, that their aunt and uncle had made choices about money that hurt our family, and that someday I would be able to explain the rest, and until then we would be okay on our own, because we always had been, just the 3 of us. Josh, who was 12 when David died, took it hardest, asking me more than once why Aunt Denise didn't love them anymore, why Cousin Tyler stopped answering his texts, sitting on the edge of his bed some nights just staring at his phone waiting for a message that never came, and I had no good answer for a 12-year-old boy beyond. Some people show love with money, and when the money's an issue, the love goes with it, which even I knew wasn't a satisfying answer but was the truest one I had. That was the beginning of 6 years I now think of as my training period, though I did not call it that at the time, I just called it surviving. I went back to bookkeeping work almost immediately, First freelance for two small local businesses, a landscaping company and a small dental practice, learning their invoicing systems and payroll schedules from scratch, then eventually managing the books for a regional plumbing supply company out of Millbrook. Work that used every skill I'd built at First Ohio Savings and let me support my kids without touching a dollar of the $25,000 that remained in my account, which I put untouched into a separate savings account earmarked for Josh and Ellie's education. The one part of David's money Roger never got his hands on. The one decision from that whole terrible period I never once regretted. I finished paying off our mortgage 2 years ahead of the original schedule through sheer stubborn frugality. The same kind David had taught me at that kitchen table years before, clipping coupons, driving the same aging cars until they finally gave out, taking on extra bookkeeping clients during tax season, packing lunches instead of buying them, cutting my own hair for 2 full years until a client of mine, a hairdresser I did books for, offered to trade services, and telling my kids no to things their friends had without ever telling them why, letting them believe it was just what our family did rather than a survival strategy against people who had already taken so much. And twice a year, quietly, on David's birthday and on the anniversary of his death, without telling anyone, I called Harold Voss, the attorney whose name I'd found on that last page of the ledger. Harold had been David's attorney for a small business matter years earlier, a contract dispute with a general contractor who tried to shortchange David on a large commercial wiring job, a dispute David had, characteristically, handled with more paperwork and less shouting than anyone expected, documenting every conversation, every change order, every delay, until the contractor's own lawyer advised him to settle rather than face David's meticulous records in front of a judge. David had liked Harold enough to keep his number afterward, and it turned out, though I did not learn the full extent of it until much later, that David had gone back to Harold quietly, about 2 years before he died, after an incident with Roger I will get to later, and set something in motion that neither Roger nor Denise ever knew existed for the rest of their lives. Every time I called Harold during those 6 years, ostensibly just checking in on nothing in particular, making small talk about David's memory, asking after his own family out of genuine fondness that had grown between us over the years, he would tell me the same 3 words, spoken with a gentle certainty that I clung to more than I ever admitted. It's still there. I did not fully understand what that meant, but I trusted David enough, even from beyond his own life, to keep asking, and I trusted Harold enough, this careful, quiet man who had clearly loved my husband's mind the same way I had, to keep believing him. 6 years is a long time to live with a wound you can't discuss at holidays, explaining to new coworkers and new friends why you don't see your late husband's family, watching their faces try to reconcile the story with the reasonable, careful woman standing in front of them. Some of them clearly wondering, however briefly, if Denise's version might actually hold some truth, a suspicion I could feel sometimes in the careful way certain acquaintances phrase their questions. But it is also a long time to watch a pattern develop from a careful distance, and that is exactly what I did, almost without meaning to, the way you can't help noticing weather patterns in a place you've lived your whole life. I heard things secondhand, the way you do in a small town, from mutual acquaintances who didn't know or didn't care that Denise and I weren't speaking, from a woman at my church who also attended Denise's, from a former customer of David's who ran into Roger at a golf course and mentioned it to me at the grocery store without any idea what it meant to me, standing there in the cereal aisle telling me casually that Roger sure seemed to be doing well for himself these days. Wasn't that nice, family sticking together like that? I heard that Roger's real estate fund had grown to include dozens of investors from 3 counties, mostly retirees who trusted him, because Denise's church connections gave him instant credibility. People who had known Denise for 20 years and figured her husband couldn't possibly be running anything dishonest. Not a man who ushered on Sundays and coached Little League and gave a testimony once at a men's retreat about the importance of financial stewardship, an irony that still makes me shake my head. I heard that they'd bought a second vacation property in Hilton Head, then sold it 18 months later at what people assumed was a loss, but which I, doing rough math in my head from public deed records, I looked up one evening out of pure obsessive curiosity, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop long after the kids were asleep. Suspected was something closer to a shell game, moving money between properties to make the fund look active and profitable to new investors, chasing quarterly statements that never quite matched reality. None of it was technically my business anymore, or so I told myself every time I caught myself thinking about it, staring at those deed records at midnight and wondering why I couldn't just let it go the way any sensible person probably would have, until the day the call came that changed everything a second time. It came on a Sunday afternoon in April, almost exactly 6 years after David's death, while I was in the backyard hanging laundry on the line the way I still did to save on the electric bill, clothespins in my apron pocket, a warm wind pushing the sheets sideways, and it was Denise's voice on the other end of my phone for the first time in longer than I could remember, sounding smaller than I had ever heard it. None of the bright performative warmth from 6 years earlier, none of the icy fury from the years after that. She said she and Roger needed to talk to me about something important, that they wanted to come by, that it concerned family, and would I please just hear them out. I stood there with a wet dish towel in my hand for a long moment before I answered, watching the sheets snap in the wind, feeling something cold settle in my stomach that I couldn't quite name yet, and I almost said no. I am glad, now, more than I can express, that I did not. They arrived that Tuesday evening looking nothing like the couple who had once sat at my kitchen table, telling me not to worry about anything, that family would take care of it. Roger had lost weight in a way that read as stress rather than health, his suit jacket hanging slightly loose at the shoulders, the collar of his shirt a half size too big now, and his usual expensive watch, the one he'd worn to every family event for a decade, was missing from his wrist entirely. A detail I clocked immediately out of old bank training habit, the kind of small absence that tells you something significant has already happened before anyone says a word. Denise's hands shook slightly around the coffee cup I handed her without thinking, an old reflex of hospitality I couldn't quite suppress even after everything. And for the first time in 18 years of knowing her, she looked at me like she needed something rather than like she was giving me something, her eyes darting around my kitchen in a way that felt almost like appraisal, though I didn't understand yet exactly what she was appraising. They told me, in halting pieces that took almost 40 minutes to fully unfold, sitting at the same kitchen table where they'd once maneuvered me into signing away $60,000, that Rogers' fund had, in their words, hit a rough patch with the market, that several investors were asking for redemptions all at once, that their own retirement accounts had been, quote, temporarily reallocated into the fund for tax efficiency, and were now tied up in the same rough patch, and that the bank had begun foreclosure proceedings on their house 4 months earlier, a fact they had apparently told no one, not even Denise's own church community, out of what I could only assume was pure shame. Roger's hands were folded tightly on the table in front of him the entire time, his knuckles pale, and he kept glancing at the clock on my kitchen wall as though counting down to something. Then came the ask, delivered by Denise in a tone that tried very hard to sound like family and mostly just sounded like fear dressed up as love. They wanted to move in with me, just for a few months, just until things stabilized, and they wanted, more than anything, she said with what looked like real tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, to finally build a relationship with Josh and Ellie before, and here she paused meaningfully, glancing down at her hands, before it's too late for that kind of thing, before they are grown and gone, and it's too late to matter. I sat across from them in the same kitchen where they had once handed me paperwork to sign, while my husband's body was barely cold in the ground, and I felt something settle inside me that I can only describe as clarity, a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in 6 years of low-grade anger and grief tangled together. 6 years of quiet investigation into their pattern. 6 years of Harold Voss telling me it's still there every time I called. 6 years of my own children asking why their aunt and uncle didn't love them anymore. All of it crystallized into a single decision that I made in about 4 seconds, while Denise waited for my answer with her coffee cup trembling slightly in her hands. I told them yes. I told them they could stay in the guest room and the small office David had once used for his business paperwork, that we would figure out logistics together, that family should help family. I meant every word of it, though not in the way they understood it in that moment. I had spent 6 years being told I was a thief without ever getting to defend myself, without ever having proof strong enough to make anyone in that family listen. Now, for the first time, I had them inside my own walls, in a house I knew every inch of, and I intended to find out exactly what they had done, with the same patience my father had taught me for listening to a lock until it clicked into place. The first week they lived in my house, I did nothing but watch, because that is what 6 years of quiet training had taught me to do well, better than almost anything else. I gave them the guest room and let them move David's old office furniture out into the garage, stacking his old filing cabinet and drafting table against the far wall under a tarp, to make space for what Roger called, without a hint of irony, his home command center, 2 monitors, and a filing box with a small brass padlock on it that he set up on the desk that had once held David's invoices, his neat block handwriting still visible on the underside of one drawer, where he'd once labeled a client's account number in permanent marker. A small ghost of David in a room now occupied by the man he'd never trusted. I made a point of being pleasant, unremarkable, the exhausted single mother happy to have help around the house, offering to make extra portions at dinner, asking Denise mundane questions about her drive over, laughing a little too readily at Roger's jokes about traffic and gas prices, and I let that performance do the work my silence had done for 6 years. I moved through my own house like furniture, present but unremarkable, exactly the impression I needed them to have of me, refilling water glasses, folding their laundry alongside my own without complaint, letting Denise direct small pieces of the household, as though she were doing me a favor by taking charge. What I noticed first was the phone. Roger's phone rang constantly, buzzing against the kitchen counter at all hours, morning, mid-afternoon, sometimes as late as 11 at night, and he answered almost none of the calls in front of me, stepping out to the back patio or the driveway the moment his screen lit up. Speaking in a low, urgent register I only caught fragments of through the window screen while I washed dishes at the sink, positioned, not entirely by accident, close enough to hear. I heard the words redemption freeze more than once, spoken in a tone that tried to sound casual and failed. I heard him say, "I told you, the audit is just a formality, don't panic on me now," to someone he did not name, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him before, all his usual smooth confidence stripped away when he thought no one was listening. I heard him promise a man named Gary that the Q2 distributions would go out by the 15th, a date that came and went with no distributions that I ever saw evidence of, and a follow-up call 2 days later where Roger's voice had climbed half an octave trying to explain a delay to what sounded like the same man, something about a wire that got, quote, held up in processing, a phrase I recognized immediately as the kind of vague, technical-sounding excuse people use when they have no real answer at all. Denise, meanwhile, spent her days on her phone scrolling and posting as though nothing in her life had changed at all, still captioning photos of herself with words like grateful and blessed, still, within her first 10 days in my house, ordering a $400 handbag that arrived while she cried to me over coffee about how tight things were, how she didn't know how they'd gotten here, how grateful she was that family like me still existed in this world. I watched her sign for that package at my own front door and thank the delivery driver with a smile before coming back inside to tell me, not 5 minutes later, that she'd had to sell her wedding ring to a pawn shop the month before, the same hand that had just signed for a designer handbag now clutching a tissue as she described her sacrifice. The contrast between what they said and how they lived was the first red flag, but it was far from the last. Within 2 weeks, I noticed that despite claiming they had almost nothing left, Roger continued making payments on a storage unit 30 minutes away in a town called Fairhaven. Information I only learned because an auto-pay notification popped up on the shared family tablet he'd set up for, quote, keeping everyone connected. A well-meaning gesture toward the grandchildren angle that apparently he did not realize also synced his email previews to a device my own kids used for homework, giving me a small, unguarded window into his inbox every time a notification came through, while Josh worked on algebra at the kitchen table beside it, glancing over occasionally at a screen he had no idea was quietly informing his mother's investigation. I also noticed that he never once let anyone else touch the padlocked filing box in what used to be David's office, carrying the small brass key to it on his own keyring rather than leaving it anywhere accessible, checking his pocket for that keyring several times a day in an unconscious gesture. I began to recognize the way you recognize any nervous tick once you know to look for it, and that he kept the office door closed at all times, which in a house I had lived in for 18 years and knew every inch of, including the fact that the doorknob had a warded lock so old and simple that my father would have laughed at Roger for thinking it offered any real security at all. A lock I could have opened blind with a bent paperclip in under 30 seconds, told me almost everything I needed to know about what he was hiding, if not yet the specific details. I began keeping a small notebook of my own, hidden inside a box of tampons in the bathroom cabinet where I knew neither of them would ever look, jotting down dates, times, overheard fragments, patterns, the same instinct that had once made me good at catching discrepancies in loan files now turned quietly, patiently, on my own family, building a timeline the same way I used to build a case file for a suspicious loan application, one small entry at a time until the pattern became undeniable. The opportunity to look closer came from an ordinary household accident, the kind that happens in every home eventually, and that I recognized, even as it was unfolding, as a gift I hadn't planned for but knew immediately how to use. About 3 weeks into their stay, the ceiling fan in the guest room, the one Denise and Roger were using, started making a grinding noise and then stopped working entirely, along with the outlet beside the bed that Denise complained had stopped charging her phone overnight, leaving her, in her words, completely disconnected from the world for 6 terrifying hours. An exaggeration so dramatic I nearly laughed out loud in front of her. Roger, for all his talk of command centers and diversified portfolios and quarterly distributions, could not tell a breaker from a light switch, and I watched him flip the switch on and off 6 or 7 times in the hallway with the deep, genuine confusion of a man who had clearly never once in his life opened an electrical panel or considered what happened behind a wall, muttering something about calling an electrician when he had, quite literally, one living under his own roof. I told them I'd take a look, since I'd, quote, picked up a few things living with an electrician for 18 years, which was both true and a significant understatement of exactly how much I actually knew, from watching David work, from helping him strip wire and hold flashlights and pass tools on hundreds of jobs over the years, from the countless dinner table conversations where he'd explain a tricky diagnosis to me just because he liked thinking out loud, and I was the only one who'd listen without her eyes glazing over. It took me 11 minutes to find a loose neutral connection in the fan's junction box, the kind of thing David would have fixed blindfolded, working with a small flashlight held in my teeth and a screwdriver from the kitchen junk drawer while Roger hovered in the doorway, and another few minutes to reset the tripped breaker for the outlet circuit, which Roger had somehow overloaded by running a space heater and a phone charger and a laptop dock all off the same 20-amp line. A rookie mistake David used to see constantly on service calls and always shook his head at, saying people treat electricity like it's magic instead of just math. I did it calmly, competently, without fanfare, while Roger stood in the doorway looking at me the way you might look at someone performing a magic trick they didn't ask for and don't quite trust. Denise said, "I didn't know you knew how to do that," sounding genuinely startled, and I said, "You learn things when you have to," which was truer than she understood in every possible sense. That moment mattered more than the fixed fan itself, because from then on, Roger started treating me less like a threat and more like household staff, a woman useful for fixing things and watching kids and cooking dinner, invisible in the specific way that made him careless around me, the way people are careless in front of a housekeeper or a nanny, assuming she's part of the furniture rather than a witness. That carelessness, that quiet condescension, was exactly what I needed, and I let it grow, offering to fix a wobbly cabinet hinge the following week, offering to look at Denise's car when it started making a noise, diagnosing a simple worn serpentine belt in 10 minutes that would have cost her $300 at a shop, becoming, in their eyes, harmless and helpful and beneath notice, a woman who fixed things and asked no questions and posed no threat to anyone's secrets. It was during that same repair, standing on a step stool in the guest room closet to check whether the wiring issue extended further into the wall, that I noticed the closet's back panel, the one that led to a shallow crawl space above the garage that David himself had built access to years earlier for running low-voltage cable to the far side of the house, had been pushed slightly open, not fully closed the way it should have been. Roger had been using it, I realized, as extra storage, and sitting just inside, wrapped in a garbage bag and pushed back far enough that a casual glance would have missed it entirely, was a second, smaller filing box. When he clearly thought no one would ever find behind the drywall access panel of a room, he assumed I had no reason to enter closely. In a house he assumed I understood less thoroughly than I actually did. I did not touch it that day. I am not reckless, and 6 years of watching this family taught me that patience was worth more than speed, that acting too soon on incomplete information had cost me $60,000 once already, and I would not make that mistake twice. But I made careful mental note of exactly where it sat, memorizing the angle of the bag, the fold of the plastic, the way it leaned against a roll of pink insulation, and over the following week I found small windows, 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there, when Roger took Denise to what he called investor meetings, dressed in his good suit with a leather folio under his arm, driving off in a car that wasn't even his anymore in any real sense. And I had the house to myself with Josh at practice and Ellie at a friend's. The first time I had that window, I went back to the crawl space with a flashlight and a pair of David's old work gloves I kept in the garage, and I pulled the bag out carefully, photographing exactly how it had been positioned, the exact fold of the garbage bag, the exact angle it leaned against the insulation, so I could return it undisturbed to the precise spot afterward. I worked methodically, the way I'd been trained to handle sensitive loan files years earlier, documenting before touching only with purpose, leaving no trace, my hands moving with a calm precision that would have surprised anyone who'd only ever seen me as the tired single mother scrubbing dishes and folding towels. Inside were bank statements for an account I did not recognize, under the name Heritage Capital Holdings LLC, the same shell company I had heard mentioned 6 years earlier. When I first tried to trace the $60,000, Roger had taken and gotten nothing but a vague single-page printout for my trouble. The statements showed deposits from at least 11 different individuals over the preceding 18 months, ranging from $4,000 to $60,000 each, always described in the memo line as investment contribution. A phrase so generic it told me immediately these deposits had never been properly documented with actual investment agreements. No subscription agreement, no offering memorandum. None of the paperwork any legitimate fund is legally required to provide, and withdrawals that bore no relationship to any real estate transaction I could identify. Instead of property purchases or renovation costs, I found transfers to what looked like personal expense accounts, a leased vehicle payment matching the Escalade sitting in my own driveway, a country club membership fee dated just 2 months before they'd claimed to me they couldn't afford groceries, a payment to a company that, when I later looked it up on my phone that same afternoon, turned out to be a plastic surgeon's office in Columbus, dated just 3 months before Denise had told me, tearfully, that they couldn't afford groceries, a detail so grotesque in its timing that I actually sat back on my heels in that crawl space for a moment just to steady myself. The second document I found, tucked into a manila folder beneath the bank statements, made my stomach turn in a way the money never had, in a way that felt like the floor tilting under me. It was a home equity line of credit application, dated 4 months earlier, listing my address as the collateral property, my name as the primary applicant, my social security number, which I had never given Roger but which I remembered giving, years earlier, to Denise, on a hospital intake form during a family emergency when she'd offered to handle paperwork so I could sit with David. A moment of trust I'd forgotten entirely, until it surfaced in front of me on that closet floor like a debt finally coming due. And at the bottom of the application, in a signature that was close but not quite right, close enough to fool a bank teller glancing quickly, but wrong in the small looping way my actual capital R never curved, wrong in the way the crossbar of my T sat a fraction too high, wrong in a way only someone who had signed her own name thousands of times over decades would ever notice, was a forgery of my signature. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time with that folder in my lap, my heart pounding in a way that felt almost clinical, understanding for the first time the full shape of what they intended. They were not simply asking to live in my house out of desperation, though the desperation was real enough. They needed my house, specifically its equity, built up over 18 years of David's labor and 6 more years of my relentless frugality. as collateral to keep their collapsing fund alive long enough to either pay off panicking investors or disappear before anyone could stop them entirely. And if that HELOC defaulted, if the fund collapsed anyway despite the injection of my equity, which every red flag I'd found suggested was inevitable, I would be the one legally holding the debt, the forged signature making it look, on paper, like my decision entirely, my house, my liability, my name attached to a fraud I had never agreed to, a scapegoat prepared and waiting for the exact moment they needed one. I photographed every document with my phone, careful to preserve the original folder exactly as I'd found it, the bank statements in the same order, the same slight curl to the corners, and returned everything to the crawl space precisely where it had been, sealing the access panel the way it had been before, my hands steady in a way that surprised me even as my heart still raced. Then I did something I had not done in 6 years of small, cautious check-ins. I called Harold Voss and told him everything, sitting in my car in the driveway with the engine off so no one inside would hear, speaking in a low voice with the windows up even though there was no one around, my own paranoia, by that point, having become a kind of second skin. Harold listened without interrupting for almost 15 minutes, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "Maren, I think it's time I told you what David actually set up before he died, because I believe we're going to need it very soon, sooner than either of us expected." He asked me to come to his office the next morning alone and told me to bring the ledger. I sat across from Harold Voss the next morning, in an office that smelled like old paper and coffee, its shelves lined with the kind of thick binders that made the whole room feel weighted with other people's secrets, a small window unit rattling in the corner against the spring heat, and he told me a story about my own husband that I had never fully known, even after 18 years of marriage and 6 years of grieving him alone. About 2 years before David died, Roger had approached him at a family barbecue, half drunk on confidence and cheap beer, standing too close and talking too fast, trying to get David to invest $20,000 into an early version of what would become Prout Capital Group, promising returns that, David told Harold afterward, sounded too clean, too certain, too free of the ordinary risk that comes with any real investment. David had said no politely, the way he said no to everything he didn't trust, but the conversation had bothered him enough that he came to see Harold the following week, not about the investment itself, but about protecting our family's savings from ever being touched by anyone outside our marriage, including, he'd specifically said, sitting in the very chair I was sitting in now, his own sister and her husband, if it ever came to that. What Harold had built for David, over the following months, meeting quietly, sometimes on David's lunch break, sometimes in the evening after a job, was not a simple will or a basic revocable trust, but something closer to a structural fortress, designed by a man who understood exactly how family financial predators operate, because he'd watched Roger operate at the edges of his family for over a decade without ever fully trusting him. David had moved the bulk of what would eventually become our real savings, not the life insurance, which was newer and separate, and which David had never gotten around to protecting the same way before he died. But nearly $200,000 David had quietly built over 15 years through disciplined, patient investing in low-cost index funds that he never once mentioned at that barbecue or anywhere else, not to impress anyone, into an irrevocable spendthrift trust. The trust named me and our children as sole beneficiaries, with a trustee provision that required, for any distribution, my physical presence, a notarized identity verification through a specific process Harold had built in deliberately, and a specific procedural passphrase David had chosen himself during those quiet meetings, something only Harold and I would ever know, precisely so that no power of attorney, no forged document, and no third party claiming to act on my behalf could ever touch it under any circumstances. It could not be garnished, seized, or accessed by any creditor of mine or anyone else's, because it wasn't structured as an asset I owned outright that could be attached in a lawsuit or a fraud claim. It was structured as a benefit I could only personally claim in person, on my own authority, forever, a distinction Harold explained to me slowly and carefully until I understood it as thoroughly as he did, sketching a small diagram on a legal pad to show me exactly how the layers of protection stacked on top of each other. Harold told me that David had specifically said, during the drafting of that trust, sitting in this same office years before his death. Quote, "If anything ever happens to me and my sister or her husband try to get their hands on what I built for my family, I want it to be legally impossible, not just difficult. I want there to be no door for them to even try to pick." Harold had honored that instruction to the letter. And for 6 years, while Denise told everyone I was a thief and Roger built a fraud empire on the backs of trusting retirees, that money had sat completely untouched in a set of index funds that had, if anything, grown modestly through simple compound interest, waiting for a day David could not have predicted the specific details of, but had clearly anticipated the general shape of, the way a man who spent his whole life reading warning signs in other places had finally read one correctly in his own family. That same week, Harold told me something else that changed the direction of everything that followed. He had, independently of me, been contacted 3 months earlier by an investigator named Tom Reyes from the State Division of Securities, who was building a case against Roger Prout and Prout Capital Group based on complaints from at least 9 investors who had been unable to get their money returned despite repeated promises and shifting excuses. Harold, bound by attorney-client privilege regarding David's trust, but not regarding his general knowledge of the Prout family or Roger's business practices, had agreed to speak with Reyes in general terms and had mentioned, carefully, choosing his words the way he chose everything, that David's widow might have relevant information if she were ever willing to come forward on her own. I called Tom Reyes that same afternoon, sitting in my car in the parking lot outside Harold's office because I couldn't wait until I got home. And our first conversation lasted almost 2 hours, my phone battery dropping from full to nearly dead by the time we finished. He told me, with the plain, unemotional clarity of someone who had seen this exact pattern many times before across a long career, that his office estimated Roger Prout had raised somewhere between $2 and $3 million from at least 40 individual investors over 6 years, structured as a classic affinity fraud, using Denise's church and community connections to build trust with people who would never have given their money to a stranger, paying early investors modest returns using money raised from later investors in a pattern he called, without dramatics, a textbook Ponzi structure, and diverting a significant portion directly into personal expenses, the leased vehicles, the vacations, the country club dues, all of it documented, all of it traceable if you knew where to look. He said the fund had been unable to meet redemption requests for the past 5 months, and that Roger was almost certainly, in his professional opinion, in the final stage of either attempting one last large fundraising push to buy more time or preparing to disappear entirely. A pattern he'd seen before with fraudsters who felt the walls closing in, sometimes fleeing the state entirely, sometimes simply declaring bankruptcy and leaving investors to fight over whatever scraps remained. Reyes asked whether I would be willing to help. Not in any way that would put me or my children at risk. He was careful to clarify more than once, but by providing documentation of what I'd already found in that crawl space, and potentially by allowing a small forensic data extraction device, disguised as an ordinary USB drive, to be connected briefly to Roger's laptop if the opportunity arose naturally in the course of daily life, in order to pull financial records before Roger could destroy them entirely. He explained that shredded documents alone, which I mentioned I'd already noticed piling up weekly in my recycling bin in a volume that seemed disproportionate to any normal household paperwork, suggested Roger was already in the process of destroying his paper trail as a precaution, and that the digital records might be the only complete evidence remaining once he finished. I agreed without hesitation, sitting alone in that parking lot with the phone pressed hard against my ear. 6 years of silence had earned me that much, and more. The opportunity came faster than I expected, only 10 days after my meeting with Harold. Roger asked if he could use my kitchen table for a video call with, in his words, a group of concerned investors, because his internet in the guest room kept cutting out and he needed a stronger signal. I offered to bring him coffee during the call, the same small helpful gesture I'd been performing for weeks, and while doing so, I left his laptop bag, sitting open on the counter where he'd set it down to answer the front door for a delivery, exposed for the 90 seconds it took me to plug in the small drive Raze had given me in a plain manila envelope. Initiate the extraction with a single keystroke sequence Raze had walked me through twice on the phone until I could do it without looking, my hands moving with a steadiness that surprised even me, and remove it before Roger returned to his seat, my heart hammering in a way I did not let show on my face, my expression as flat and pleasant as it had been every day for the past 3 weeks. Raze later told me that drive contained 18 months of financial records, including 3 separate spreadsheets Roger had clearly never intended anyone to see, one of which was labeled, with a bluntness that almost made me laugh out loud despite everything when Raze read it to me over the phone. Redemption Delay Excuses Master List. An actual document Roger apparently used to track which lie he'd told which investor so he wouldn't contradict himself on follow-up calls, complete with columns for investor name, excuse given, and date promised. A level of organized deception that would almost have been impressive if it hadn't destroyed so many lives. With that evidence moving through official channels, and with Harold now aware of both the trust's readiness and the forged HELOC application, I understood that the final confrontation was coming soon, faster than Roger and Denise realized. Because their own fund's collapse was accelerating on a timeline they couldn't control no matter how many more lies they told each other or themselves. What I didn't expect was how far they would go in the meantime, and it was that final piece of cruelty that ended, completely and permanently, any lingering hope I still carried that some part of the people who raised my husband still loved my family at all, even a small part, even out of habit. I want to explain why I did what I did next, because I know it will sound strange to some of you, maybe even calculating in a way that makes you uncomfortable. After everything I had already found, the forged signature, the shell company, the hidden filing box, I still had one question I needed answered before I could act on any of it, and it was not a financial question at all. I needed to know, with absolute certainty, without any room left for doubt or excuse, whether Denise and Roger were capable of basic human decency toward me if it cost them something in the moment, or whether every warm word they'd said since moving into my house was purely functional, a performance calibrated entirely toward keeping me compliant until they got what they needed. I decided to test it in the most direct way I could think of, and I am not ashamed of it, because what I learned justified every bit of the discomfort it caused me to plan. On a Thursday evening, with Josh at basketball practice and Ellie at a friend's house, giving me a clean window with only the 3 of us in the house, I waited until Roger and Denise were both in the living room, Roger on his laptop working on what I now knew, thanks to that extracted spreadsheet, was a fraudulent pitch deck for new investors he was trying to recruit even as the whole structure crumbled beneath him. Denise scrolling through her phone on the couch with the television playing quietly in the background, some home renovation show neither of them was actually watching, and I staged a collapse in the kitchen doorway between them, positioned so both of them would have a clear line of sight the moment they looked up. I had thought carefully about how to make it believable without being reckless, choosing a controlled slump against the doorframe rather than a hard fall. A hand clutched to my chest. A gasped, unsteady call of Denise's name before letting myself sink to the floor. Eyes half open, breathing audibly shallow, in a scene deliberately reminiscent of the exact way David had described feeling in the minutes before his own heart attack. A detail I knew Denise remembered because she had asked about it at his funeral, standing beside the casket asking me, in a rare unguarded moment, if he'd said anything, if he'd known. I had also, 3 days earlier, installed a small motion-activated camera on top of the bookshelf across from the kitchen doorway, disguised as a smart speaker, telling Denise it was a gift from Josh's school fundraiser that I hadn't gotten around to setting up properly. A lie so mundane she hadn't even glanced at it twice, barely looking up from her phone when I mentioned it. It was recording the entire time, its small indicator light dark, exactly as advertised, capturing everything from an angle that left no room for later interpretation or excuse. What that camera captured still turns my stomach when I think about it, even now, months later. Denise looked up from her phone, said my name once, sharply, more startled than alarmed, and then, instead of moving toward me, called out to Roger, asking if I was being dramatic again, a phrase she used to plant her own excuse for inaction before she'd even fully processed what was happening. a reflex of self-protection so immediate it must have been years in the making. Practiced on countless smaller occasions, I probably never even noticed at the time. Roger did not look up from his laptop for nearly 8 full seconds. Seconds I counted later, frame by frame, on the footage, his eyes still moving across his screen while I lay on the floor of my own kitchen making the sounds of a woman in medical distress. His fingers still occasionally tapping at the keyboard, as though some part of his brain had decided the pitch deck simply could not wait. When he did look up, he did not come toward me either. He stood, walked past me, close enough that his shoe brushed my outstretched hand, close enough that I felt the air move, and went to the small office off the living room, the one with the padlocked filing box, and I heard the click of the lock and the rustle of him gathering papers before he came back out 15 seconds later, laptop bag now zipped and slung over his shoulder, and said, to Denise, not to me, not once looking down at me directly, "We need to get that pitch deck backed up somewhere else just in case." And then, almost as an afterthought, glancing down at me on the floor for the first time, "Is she breathing okay? Should we call someone?" The question delivered with all the urgency of someone asking whether it might rain later. Denise, to her limited credit, did eventually kneel beside me and check my pulse, though her first words were not, "Are you okay?" but "Did you take your blood pressure medicine today?" A question designed, I understood even in the moment, to establish in advance that whatever was happening to me was my own fault and not anything requiring urgent concern or responsibility from either of them. I let the moment stretch another 30 seconds, long enough to be certain the footage had captured everything I needed. My own heart actually pounding for real now, adrenaline making the performance easier than I expected, before I let out a slow breath, blinked as though returning to consciousness, and said I must have just gotten lightheaded. I probably just need to eat something. I skipped lunch again. Denise helped me to a chair with visible relief that she wouldn't need to do anything more complicated than that. Relief that was almost funny in its transparency, already reaching for her phone again before I'd even fully sat down. Roger, laptop bag still on his shoulder, said he was glad I was okay in a tone that suggested he was already thinking about something else entirely. And then, within 90 seconds, was back in the office with the door closed, resuming whatever he'd been protecting before I ever hit the floor, the sound of him settling back into his chair audible through the thin wall. I sat at my own kitchen table that night after they'd both gone to bed, watching that footage on a loop in the dark with headphones, and so no sound would carry upstairs, my untouched cup of tea going cold beside me, and I felt something inside me finish closing that had been cracked open since the week David died. These were not people capable of rescue when rescue cost them something, even something as small as 30 seconds of attention. They had proven it on camera, in my own home, 6 years to the month after they had first sat me down at that same table and told me not to worry, that family would take care of everything. I saved that footage in 3 separate places, a cloud backup, a physical drive in a fireproof lockbox, and a copy on a flash drive I gave to Harold Voss with a 2-line email explaining exactly what it showed, and went to bed with a calm I had not felt in longer than I could remember, because I finally understood, without any ambiguity left, exactly who I was dealing with, and exactly how little I owed them going forward, in this life or any accounting of it. The end came faster than I expected, and it came because Roger's own desperation finally outran his caution in a way that gave Ray's exactly the opening he needed. 11 days after the night I staged my collapse, Ray's called to tell me that the extracted financial records, combined with 9 formal investor complaints and evidence of the forged HELOC application, which Harold had already reported to the bank's fraud department, along with a notarized statement from me confirming I had never signed or authorized it, gave the state enough to move forward with an arrest warrant for Roger on charges of securities fraud and wire fraud, and that they were coordinating with the bank to time the arrest at a moment that would prevent him from liquidating or transferring any remaining assets first. He told me the bank had scheduled a meeting for that Friday to finalize what they believed was a legitimate home equity line of credit closing, the one built on my forged signature, and that Roger did not yet know his signature verification had already flagged as suspicious on the bank's end weeks earlier, triggering their own internal fraud review that Roger, in his rush and arrogance, had somehow never noticed. He asked whether I would be willing to attend that meeting, since Roger and Denise had already pressured me twice that week to, quote, just come sign the final paperwork so we can get this behind us as a family. I said yes immediately, because I understood this was the moment David's ledger had been warning me about since before I even knew what it meant, since 2 a.m, 3 days after his funeral, sitting alone at that kitchen table with coffee grounds still on my hands. That Friday morning, Roger came to find me in the kitchen, with an urgency I hadn't seen from him since he first moved in. All traces of the warm, concerned family man performance stripped away entirely, replaced by something closer to raw panic, wearing a suit that no longer fit him quite right. He told me the meeting at the bank was at 11 o'clock, that all I needed to do was come in and sign where indicated, that it was a simple formality to release funds that would, and here his voice actually shook slightly, save this entire family from losing everything, including, he added, your house, Maren, because if this fund goes under completely, the fallout is going to touch everyone connected to it. And don't you want to protect Josh and Ellie's home? Don't you owe them that much stability? Denise stood beside him nodding along, her earlier warmth long gone, replaced by something tighter and more openly desperate, saying, we did so much for you after David died, Maren, helping you through the hardest time of your life, taking you under our wing. The least you can do now is help us the same way. Family helps family. That's what we've always believed, the same phrase, family helps family. She had used to talk me into signing the original authorization 6 years earlier, recycled now with a different urgency behind it. I let that statement sit in the air for a moment, tasting the full weight of its dishonesty, because the audacity of it, 6 years after they stole $85,000 from my dead husband's life insurance and told my entire family I'd spent it on myself while cutting my children out of every holiday, was almost impressive in its shamelessness, almost a kind of dark achievement. Then I told them I would come to the bank, and I got in the car with them, Denise in the front seat beside Roger, me in the back like a passenger being delivered somewhere rather than a woman walking toward the end of 6 years of waiting, watching the familiar streets of Millbrook pass by the window, because I needed to be there in person for what was about to happen anyway, and because some part of me needed to see their faces when it did. The bank was a modern branch of First Trust with high ceilings and a wall of glass separating the lobby from a row of private offices. The kind of building designed to feel reassuring, all soft carpeting and quiet piped-in music. And we were led into one of those offices by a lone officer I did not recognize, a young man who seemed entirely unaware of the storm about to arrive in his tidy little room with its potted plant and its motivational poster about teamwork. Roger sat close beside me, his knee bouncing under the table in a rhythm I could feel through the floor, sliding a stack of papers toward me with a pen already uncapped, the Hellock closing documents, my forged signature already present on the earlier application, now needing what he called a final confirming signature to release the funds, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed the pen toward me. Denise sat across from us, her smile fixed and brittle in a way that had clearly cost her effort to maintain, saying, this is such a relief, isn't it? Everything finally coming together. We can finally put all this behind us, her voice climbing just slightly at the end of each sentence, the strain audible if you knew to listen for it. I did not pick up the pen. I looked at Roger, and then at Denise, taking my time, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable, and I said the only thing I had planned to say for 6 years, the sentence I had rehearsed quietly in my head so many times, in the shower, in the car, lying awake at night, that it came out steady and clear despite the pounding of my own heart. I told them I already gave your family the only thing that was ever really mine to give, which was the benefit of the doubt for 6 years, while you told everyone I stole from my own children. I am not signing anything else. Not now. Not ever. Roger's face went through several emotions in rapid succession, confusion, then anger, then something close to pleading, as he said my name and reached toward the papers as though proximity alone might make me change my mind. As though the physical nearness of the pen could substitute for the trust he'd spent 6 years methodically destroying. That is when the office door opened, and Tom Reyes walked in with 2 uniformed officers behind him, along with a bank compliance officer, a woman named Diane Kessler, who had been reviewing the branch's fraud flags all morning waiting for exactly this meeting to happen, her expression professionally neutral in a way that somehow made the moment feel even more final. She placed a folder on the table and said, calmly, in the voice of someone who had done this many times before, that the bank's signature verification department had already identified irregularities on the original HELOC application weeks earlier and had flagged the account, and that Mrs. Whitaker had provided a notarized statement confirming the signature was forged, which meant the loan had never been legitimately authorized to begin with and would be voided in its entirety. Reyes then informed Roger that he was under arrest for securities fraud and wire fraud in connection with Pruitt Capital Group, and began reading him his rights while one of the officers guided him to stand, his chair scraping loudly against the floor in the sudden silence of the room, the lone officer at the next desk over freezing mid-sentence with a phone still held to his ear. Denise's reaction was the part I will remember longest, longer even than the sound of the handcuffs. She did not ask what was happening to Roger. She turned to me instead, her face contorted into something I had never seen on her before in 18 years. Real, unfiltered fury, stripped of every layer of church lady warmth she'd ever performed. And said, "How could you do this to your own family?" Her voice cracking on the word family in a way that almost would have been sad if I hadn't already watched her step over me on a kitchen floor 11 days earlier without so much as offering her hand. I looked at her, thinking of the ledger in my sock drawer, of 6 years of holidays my children spent without cousins or grandparents, because of a lie she constructed and repeated for 6 years to anyone who would listen, of David's 91-year-old aunt who died believing I was a thief, of the footage of her husband stepping over my collapsed body to protect a laptop bag. And I said, "I'm not doing anything to my family, Denise. I'm finally protecting what's left of it." Then I stood, thanked Diane Kessler for her time, and walked out of that office without looking back once, my footsteps steady across the lobby's soft carpet, out through the glass doors into the ordinary sunlight of a Friday afternoon, the whole world outside that bank looking exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, as though nothing at all had just ended. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of what Reyes's office had built came into public view through a series of court filings that made the local paper twice, once when the charges were announced, and once when the plea deal was finalized, each article accompanied by a photo of Roger looking smaller and grayer than the man who'd once handed me legal pads full of investment jargon at my own kitchen table. Roger Pruitt was charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft related to the forged HELOC application, facing a combined federal and state case built on testimony from 23 investors. Forensic financial records recovered from the extraction I'd helped facilitate, and documentation of the fraudulent shell company Heritage Capital Holdings. He eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial, receiving 9 years in federal prison, along with a restitution order requiring repayment of just over $2.1 million to defrauded investors, a sum everyone involved understood he would likely never fully repay given the seizure and liquidation of what few real assets remained in his name, the leased vehicles long since repossessed. The storage unit in Fairhaven revealed to contain nothing but furniture from the foreclosed house and a safe with less than $4,000 in cash inside it, a pathetic remainder of a scheme that had once moved millions. Denise was not charged criminally, since prosecutors determined she had not directly participated in the securities fraud itself in a way that met the legal threshold. Though she was named in a civil suit brought by several investors who argued she had knowingly used her community and church relationships to recruit victims on Roger's behalf, appearing at investment dinners, vouching for Roger's character to women she'd known for decades, a case that eventually settled with her surrendering what remained of her personal assets, including her boutique's remaining inventory and the small amount of jewelry that hadn't already been liquidated to cover legal fees. The house they had lost to foreclosure months earlier was already gone by the time any of this became public. The leased vehicles were repossessed within weeks. Word spread through Millbrook and the surrounding towns quickly, the way it does in places where everyone eventually knows everyone else's business. And Denise, once so careful about her public image, so devoted to her curated feed of soft lighting and grateful captions, found herself unable to show her face at the same church where she'd recruited half of Roger's investors, The same women who'd once trusted her completely now crossing the parking lot to avoid her, eventually moving to live with a cousin 2 states away. A small, quiet ending for a woman who had spent 6 years loudly deciding my reputation for me without ever once being asked to answer for her own. For my part, the restitution process took time, nearly a year and a half of paperwork and court dates and patient waiting that felt, after everything, almost peaceful by comparison. But it was thorough, because I had cooperated fully with Ray's investigation and provided the forensic evidence that helped establish the scope and timeline of the fraud. The court's restitution order specifically identified me as a victim, entitled to recovery of the original $60,000 Roger had taken under the guise of managing it for my children's education. A sum that came back to me, slowly, in a series of court-ordered payments over the following 18 months, through the liquidation of whatever assets the court could seize and the wage garnishment ordered against Roger's future prison work assignments, small as those payments were. It was not the full $85,000 from the original insurance policy, since $25,000 had, after all, remained safely in my own account from the very beginning thanks to that first small act of resistance. That one small delay when I told Roger the bank needed to deposit the check first. But combined with what came back through restitution, my children's education fund was finally made whole. 6 years and one federal fraud case later than it should have been, but whole nonetheless. Harold Voss and I finalized the release of David's trust not long after the criminal case concluded, and I sat across from him in that same office with a notary present. Spoke the passphrase David had chosen years earlier without ever telling me exactly what it would someday be used for. A phrase so ordinary and so entirely him that I laughed and cried at the same time when I finally said it out loud, and watched nearly $200,000, grown modestly over 6 years of careful, unremarkable investment, become available to me and my children exactly as David had designed it to, untouched, unreachable by anyone who wasn't supposed to reach it, waiting the entire time for a moment he could not have specifically foreseen but had clearly, thoroughly, lovingly prepared for anyway. The last and greatest thing he ever built for us, quieter than the house, more permanent than any wall he ever framed. I used part of that money to pay off the last of Josh's tuition costs outright. No loans, no interest, and set aside the rest for Ellie's college fund exactly as David would have wanted. And I kept working my bookkeeping job not because I needed to anymore, but because, after everything, I understood the value of quiet, competent work more than I ever had before. Work that asks nothing of you but honesty and attention. Work that cannot lie to you the way people sometimes can. I think about David's ledger often, that beat-up leather notebook Denise once called worthless work junk and threw in a garbage bag without a second thought on the worst day of my life. I think about how a man who never once raised his voice at his own family, who avoided confrontation his entire life, who let his sister talk over him at every holiday for 18 years rather than cause a scene, still found a way to protect the people he loved from years beyond the reach of his own lifetime, simply by trusting his instincts about people and refusing to leave that trust unprotected, by doing the quiet, unglamorous work of building a fortress instead of just hoping for the best. I think about the 6 years I spent being quietly, wrongly labeled a thief by people who knew, better than anyone alive, exactly where that money had actually gone. And I think about how much of that time I spent believing I had to prove my innocence loudly to be believed, when the truth is that patience, documentation, and a willingness to wait for facts to speak for themselves did more for my family than any argument, any confrontation, any raised voice ever could have. If I could leave you with one thing from all of this, it would be that integrity is not loud, and it does not need to defend itself in real time against people who have already decided what story they want to tell about you. It waits. It documents. It protects the people who deserve protecting, quietly, patiently, the way David protected us from 4 states and 6 years and one collapsing fraud away. And when the truth finally does come out, and it almost always does, given enough time and enough patience, it comes out complete, undeniable, and entirely on its own terms, in a way that no amount of shouting could have ever achieved. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely, someone your whole family believed was above suspicion? How did you handle it, and did you have the proof you needed when the moment finally came, Or did you have to build it yourself, piece by piece, the way I did? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one of them. If you believe family should never be a shield for theft, and that the quiet ones who keep the receipts are usually the ones who save everybody in the end, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.